It all started with the sound of screeching brakes and a furious banging on the hood of my car, and before I could even put it into park, there she was. Karen, standing like a self-appointed traffic warden in the middle of the lot, waving a clipboard as if it were a sheriff's badge, yelling that I had violated her HOA parking rule and that, if I didn't pay a fine immediately, she'd call the cops to drag me out of my own space. The funny part was, I didn't even know we had an HOA for parking, and the emotional sting of it hit me with absurd comedy because she wasn't just serious, she was trembling with rage as if I had committed a crime against humanity by daring to park in front of my own building. She shouted about community standards and enforcement guidelines, words that sounded more like legal jargon she had memorized from a Judge Judy marathon, while I sat there gripping the steering wheel, torn between laughing at the insanity and wondering how this circus would escalate. I decided to play along, asking her to show me the rulebook, and without hesitation she slapped down a stapled packet of papers titled Parking Lot HOA Constitution, which looked like it had been typed up in Microsoft Word the night before. It wasn't just dramatic, it was hilarious. Pages of nonsense rules like cars must be washed twice a week or face penalties, no parking at angles greater than 45 degrees, and my favorite, SUVs must park in the back rows because they intimidate smaller cars. I stared at her with wide eyes, pretending to be in awe of this masterpiece of delusion, and then calmly told her I wasn't part of her HOA and never signed anything, which only sent her into orbit. Her eyes bulged, she jabbed her finger at me, and with a shriek that echoed across the lot, she declared that refusing to join was a violation in itself, and I was officially trespassing in my own spot. She whipped out her phone, dialed 911, and while dramatically pacing, she narrated the entire situation to the dispatcher like an actress auditioning for a soap opera, claiming I was a dangerous threat to community order. Within minutes the red and blue lights flashed across the pavement, and 2 officers stepped out looking utterly exhausted, clearly bracing themselves for another one of Karen's notorious calls, because the first words out of their mouths weren't "What happened?" but rather "Karen, what now?" which made me choke back laughter. She wasted no time, pointing at me like a prosecuting attorney, ranting about how I was defying the HOA, causing chaos, and disrespecting the sacred rules of parking lot harmony, while I leaned against my car sipping coffee from my travel mug, acting like this was nothing more than free entertainment. The cops exchanged a look that screamed, "Here we go again," and asked me for my side of the story, so I explained calmly that I had never signed up for her HOA and that I owned the apartment complex, which meant technically, I owned the entire parking lot she was pretending to rule. But instead of accepting that, she burst into hysterics, accusing me of lying, waving her homemade rulebook, and demanding the officers arrest me for non-compliance. The absurdity of it all mixed with the drama made the scene so chaotic that neighbors started stepping out onto their balconies, filming with their phones, whispering to each other about how Karen had finally lost it. One tenant shouted down that she had fined him last week for parking too close to the yellow line. Another yelled that she had left notes on his windshield threatening to tow his car if he didn't realign it by 2 inches, and the flood of complaints only added to Karen's meltdown as she screamed at everyone to respect authority. The officers, trying to stay professional, finally asked for paperwork showing her authority, and when she handed over her Constitution, the younger officer couldn't help but laugh out loud at the ridiculous rules. His partner shot him a warning glance, but even he was hiding a smirk. Karen demanded to know why they weren't arresting me, and in a fit of pure dramatic comedy, she tried to block my car by standing in front of it and yelling that until I paid her HOA dues, I wasn't leaving. The cops had to physically move her out of the way, and as she shrieked about justice, I casually pulled out my phone, dialed my property manager, and put him on speaker to confirm in front of everyone that I was indeed the landlord. Karen's face froze, her rage meeting disbelief, but instead of backing down, she doubled her volume, insisting that even landlords had to answer to the HOA. The neighbors erupted in laughter, the cops shook their heads, and I just leaned back, letting the scene play out like the opening act of a comedy drama I knew would only get wilder. That was the moment I realized Karen had no idea who she was really up against, and if she wanted a war over parking, she had just parked herself in the wrong battle. The morning after Karen's spectacular meltdown in the parking lot, I woke to the sound of papers being slipped under every door in the building, and by the time I opened mine, there was a glossy flyer titled Mandatory Parking Lot HOA Guidelines, effective immediately. I laughed so hard I nearly choked on my coffee because the document looked like she had stayed up all night in a fever dream designing new rules that made the U.S. tax code look simple. Page 1 started with a bold proclamation. All residents must pay $75 a month in parking compliance fees to ensure safety, fairness, and community pride. Page 2 listed violations so absurd they read like satire. Parking backward in a spot was now punishable by a $200 fine, cars larger than compact size had to pay oversized vehicle surcharges, and my personal favorite, residents who own red vehicles must park in spaces 9 through 12 only to maintain color balance in the lot. By the time I finished reading, I realized she had essentially written a stand-up comedy routine disguised as law, and I could already hear tenants arguing in the hallway, demanding to know what gave her the right. Karen, of course, had positioned herself in the lobby like a dictator giving out decrees, waving her flyers around and yelling at anyone who questioned her authority, insisting that all civilized neighborhoods run on order. She even had a whistle around her neck, which she blew at random intervals as if she were refereeing a basketball game, and the sheer drama of the scene had people recording TikToks of her antics while she basked in the spotlight, mistaking mockery for respect. Later that day, the drama hit peak levels when she started walking up and down the parking lot with a notepad, writing fake citations to stick on windshield. One car was cited for being dusty, another for parking at an offensive angle, and one unlucky tenant got 3 tickets on the same day, one for a crooked park job, one for worn-out tires, and one because his car supposedly looked too aggressive. Tenants were furious, but Karen stood her ground like Napoleon on a battlefield, quoting her HOA guidelines as if they were scripture. I watched from my balcony sipping an iced tea, amused but also fascinated by how far she was willing to go. She didn't just want control, she wanted to invent a kingdom out of thin air, and somehow she believed she was untouchable. What she didn't know was that her nonsense was only fueling the neighborhood against her. One group of tenants created a group chat called Karen Resistance, where they swapped photos of her bizarre notes, joked about staging a fake protest, and even debated spray painting down with parking tyranny on the asphalt. The humor was off the charts, but underneath it there was genuine frustration because she wasn't just being funny, she was actually harassing people daily, and it was starting to feel like a real war zone in the lot. Things took a funnier yet more dramatic turn one evening when a couple of tenants returned from work to find their cars booted with bright orange clamp. Karen had bought them online and declared them official HOA enforcement tools. The couple was furious, demanding she remove them, but she refused, yelling that they had unpaid HOA dues and needed to settle their accounts immediately. They threatened to call the cops, but she arrogantly claimed the law was on her side, and that's when I decided it was time to add a little spice of my own. I walked over, calm as ever, and asked her where the money from the citations and dues was going. Without missing a beat, she claimed it was being used to maintain the lot. When I pressed her, she proudly gestured to a tiny patch of gravel where she had sprinkled some store-bought mulch earlier that day, as if that justified her scheme. The crowd of tenants burst out laughing, and Karen's face turned the color of a tomato, but she doubled down, insisting that landscaping improvements were proof of the HOA's necessity. I decided to raise the stakes by asking her loudly, in front of everyone, if she had registered her HOA legally with the county or if she was just freelancing as a parking dictator. The silence that followed was golden, because her stammering gave her away. Tenants began booing, some even tore up the flyers she had shoved under their doors, and others chanted, "No more HOA," like it was a protest march. Karen blew her whistle so hard it sounded like a train horn, but the more she yelled, the funnier it got, and the tenants didn't back down. That night, the drama moved online. Someone posted a video of her finding a car for having two shiny headlights, and within hours it went viral on local Facebook groups under the title, HOA Queen Loses Her Mind. The comments section roasted her endlessly, with people making memes about her creating parking courts, HOA jails, and even HOA traffic police. Instead of being embarrassed, Karen printed out the post and proudly taped it to the front door of the building, calling it free publicity. She had officially crossed from being a nuisance to being a legend of chaos, and even though tenants were furious, they couldn't stop laughing at how absurd it all was. But behind the comedy there was genuine fear. Some residents worried she would start towing cars for real, and others whispered about moving out if it didn't stop. That's when I knew I couldn't just sit back sipping iced tea anymore. I had to intervene in a way that would cut her empire down without lifting a finger. The next morning, I strolled into the lot where Karen was holding what she called parking inspections, clipboard in hand as if she were conducting military drills. She had tenants line their cars up for her judgment, and when one poor guy's bumper had a scratch, she declared him unfit for HOA membership and fined him $50 on the spot. That was my cue. I clapped slowly, loudly enough for everyone to hear, and sarcastically congratulated her on running the most ridiculous circus in town. She tried to shush me, but I kept going, announcing to the crowd that anyone who paid her was throwing money into a scam, because she wasn't legally recognized, had no authority, and most importantly, she didn't own the property. I could see the panic flash in her eyes for a second, but she quickly tried to mask it by blowing her whistle again and shouting that the landlord had signed off on everything. That was the funniest part, because I was the landlord, and she had no idea she had just walked into the biggest trap of her life. I didn't reveal it yet, though. I wanted to build suspense, let her dig her own grave deeper, and when the timing was perfect, drop the truth like a bomb. For now, I let her rant, let the neighbors laugh, and let her continue to embarrass herself with rules about car colors, tire inflation levels, and license plate cleanliness, knowing that every step she took was just tightening the rope she had wrapped around her own empire. The week rolled into chaos as Karen escalated her tactics from laughable ticketing to full-scale harassment, and by the third day she had mobilized what she called her parking patrol, a squad consisting of two nosy neighbors who clearly had nothing better to do than strut around with reflective vests she bought from a hardware store clearance bin and walkie-talkies that barely work. They marched behind her as she whistled and barked orders, scribbling fake violations on their notepads, and she strutted up and down the lot as if she were a general commanding troops in a war that only existed in her mind. Tenants groaned every time they saw the trio, but the ridiculousness of it was so over the top that people started treating it like a sitcom playing out in real time. One night, a tenant deliberately parked his car diagonally across two spaces just to see what she would do, and the next morning she was shrieking like a banshee, writing 5 separate tickets for infractions ranging from wasting space to visual pollution. She even held an impromptu trial right there in the lot, making the poor guy stand in front of his car while she lectured him about community spirit and how his careless parking endangered the moral fiber of the neighborhood. People gathered with coffee cups like it was a morning show, some even placing bets on how long she'd rant before her voice cracked, and when she finally stormed off red-faced, the laughter echoed off the building walls. But Karen was not one to be humiliated without retaliation, and that evening she escalated again by filing a complaint with the city claiming that the parking lot was in violation of urban planning ordinances. When city inspectors showed up, bewildered by the nonsense complaint, she tagged along pointing at every crack in the asphalt, every oil stain, every crooked line as if she were uncovering evidence of criminal negligence. The inspectors, clearly humoring her, told her to take it up with the property owner, and her smug smile returned as she announced to everyone that she was already in communication with the landlord. I nearly laughed out loud, because the only landlord she had been communicating with was me, though she didn't know it yet. I played dumb, asked her how that was going, and she confidently declared that the landlord had no choice but to enforce her HOA rules or face consequences from the city. Tenants rolled their eyes, and I leaned back enjoying the irony, knowing she was building a castle of lies on quicksand. Later that week, she organized what she called a parking lot community safety meeting, where she demanded all tenants gather under the flickering streetlight at dusk while she preached about the dangers of an unregulated parking society. She used phrases like chaos in the lines, lawlessness in the asphalt, and anarchy in the compact spaces, as if we were living through a dystopian collapse instead of just parking cars. Her two patrol cronies handed out pamphlets filled with clip art of cars, traffic cones, and gavel icons to make it look official. When one tenant asked if this HOA was legally registered, she snapped back with, "Authority doesn't need paperwork, it needs respect." That statement alone caused half the crowd to burst out laughing, but Karen doubled down, stomping her feet and pointing at me, declaring that my refusal to join her HOA was the root cause of all disorder in the lot. She ranted about how if I just set an example by paying my dues, everyone else would follow, and that's when I knew she had truly lost touch with reality because she was pinning the fate of her imaginary kingdom on me. I didn't respond, I just smiled and let her dig deeper, because the bigger the hole, the funnier it would be when she fell into it. Her paranoia began to show more openly as the week progressed. She started sneaking around at night with a flashlight, peering into car windows and jotting down notes, accusing people of unauthorized storage if she saw gym bags or groceries inside. She claimed a tenant's air freshener was too distracting and fined him $10 for scent violations. She even knocked on one woman's door at 11 p.m. to warn her that her headlights were too bright and threatened to get her car towed if she didn't replace the bulbs with community-approved lighting. Tenants were furious but also entertained, because her madness had reached such absurd levels that people started placing bets on what she'd outlaw next. One guy joked that she'd start regulating windshield wiper speeds, and sure enough, 2 days later she fined someone for leaving their wipers raised during a rainstorm, claiming it was reckless negligence. It was like watching a parody of power trip syndrome play out in real life, except it was affecting real people's lives. By the end of the week, her antics had attracted more police visits. She called them one night insisting that a tenant had parked menacingly by leaving his car close to her patrol leader's minivan. When the officers arrived, they looked so exhausted that one muttered, "Karen again?" under his breath while the other rubbed his temples. They listened to her rant, then calmly explained that parking legally in a spot was not a crime, and that unless she had actual legal standing, she was wasting their time. Karen argued until she was red in the face, waving her fake constitution, while I stood off to the side sipping a soda and enjoying the show. When the officers finally drove off shaking their heads, she declared it was proof of systemic corruption against HOAs and vowed to escalate her campaign. That phrase alone sent chills down tenants' spines, not because they feared her, but because everyone knew it meant more madness was coming. Her big escalation came the following weekend when she attempted to physically barricade parts of the parking lot using traffic cones and yellow caution tape she had purchased from a hardware store. She set up a checkpoint at the entrance, demanding to see proof of HOA membership before allowing cars to enter. Tenants were livid, honking their horns, threatening to call real tow companies to remove the cones, while she stood in the middle of the lot blowing her whistle and shouting about restricted access zones. The entire building came alive with shouting, laughter, and phone cameras recording the spectacle, and once again she called the cops to enforce her barricade. When they arrived, she screamed at them to arrest anyone who crossed her tape, and the officers, barely hiding their laughter, told her she was obstructing traffic and could get fined herself. She turned pale, then immediately accused me of orchestrating the rebellion, pointing her finger at me like I was some evil mastermind. In truth, I hadn't lifted a finger. Her downfall was writing itself, and I was just letting the script play out. The chaos of Karen's self-declared parking patrol had reached such an absurd crescendo that even the police officers who had been dragged into her theatrics repeatedly were now arriving with the sort of weary resignation usually reserved for sitcom reruns, and it was during one particularly heated evening that things began to unravel in ways even Karen couldn't control. She had once again dialed 911, claiming that parking anarchy was threatening the safety of the community, and within minutes 2 patrol cars pulled up, their flashing lights illuminating the yellow caution tape Karen had strung across the lot like it was a crime scene. She marched toward them with the swagger of someone convinced she was the president of a nation rather than the self-appointed dictator of a parking lot, waving her clipboard and shouting about rampant violations. The officers exchanged glances that said everything. They knew they were about to waste another hour babysitting the neighborhood tyrant. Karen wasted no time pointing directly at me, shouting that I was the mastermind behind the chaos, the ringleader of rebels refusing to comply, and she demanded my immediate arrest for inciting disorderly conduct through vehicular noncompliance. The officers, suppressing grins, asked me calmly for my version, and I explained once again that no legal HOA existed, no binding contract had ever been signed, and that Karen was terrorizing tenants with her made-up rulebook. One officer sighed, rubbed his forehead, and asked Karen to provide official documentation of her authority. Proudly, she pulled out her constitution again, which by this point was dog-eared from overuse, and handed it over like it was the Magna Carta. The officer flipped through it, trying not to laugh as he read aloud rules like cars must be parked in harmony with their surrounding colors, and residents are forbidden from honking past 8 p.m. unless in emergencies approved by the HOA board. The tenants gathered around began chuckling, some openly filming, while Karen shrieked at them to stop recording and respect the sanctity of her document. The younger officer finally asked her a blunt question: who gave her the legal right to establish this HOA? Karen hesitated, her eyes darting around, before boldly declaring that the landlord had implicitly approved by not stopping her. That was my favorite part, because technically the landlord was standing right in front of her, and her entire defense rested on the assumption that I supported her nonsense. I bit my tongue, resisting the urge to end it right there, because the timing wasn't perfect yet, and I wanted her empire to collapse under the weight of its own ridiculousness. The officers, unimpressed, warned her that filing false complaints and obstructing traffic with cones could lead to real fines against her. This sent Karen into another meltdown. She started screaming about corruption, about how the system was biased against HOAs, about how law enforcement was complicit in letting residents disrespect authority. She even tried to block the officers from leaving until they promised to enforce her rules, which earned her a stern warning that she was dangerously close to getting herself arrested. The tenants erupted in applause, cheering on the officers, which only fueled Karen's fury. She blew her whistle so hard it cracked, then stomped off shouting that if the police wouldn't do their jobs, she'd escalate to higher powers. True to her word, the next day Karen doubled down by contacting various city departments. We had inspectors, zoning officials, and even a bewildered fire marshal show up over the course of a week, each responding to vague complaints filed under Karen's name. Each time, she followed them around like a tour guide of delusion, pointing out supposed violations. Cars parked too close to imaginary fire lanes, oil stains creating environmental hazards, and one particularly hilarious moment when she claimed that a cracked tail light violated public decency standards. The officials were polite but dismissive, each time telling her that unless she owned the property or had legal standing, she had no authority to enforce anything. She spun this into a conspiracy theory, telling tenants that the government was colluding against her and that she needed them to stand strong in unity. Most tenants either laughed in her face or walked away, but a couple of the more gullible neighbors started to waver under her constant pressure, unsure if maybe, just maybe, she had some sort of legal leg to stand on. That was when I realized her antics weren't just comedy anymore, they were starting to create stress, and I decided it was time to sharpen my involvement, though still without fully revealing my hand. That evening, as Karen patrolled the lot with her two cronies, flashlight beams darting like spotlights, I decided to confront her in front of everyone. She was citing a tenant for leaving a small oil drip on the pavement, demanding $50 for lot sanitation. I walked up calmly, asking her to show proof that the funds she collected were being deposited in any legitimate HOA account. She puffed up, insisting it was none of my business, then declared the funds were being used for community projects. I asked what projects exactly, and she proudly gestured toward a half-dead shrub she had planted near the entrance, claiming it was phase 1 of beautification. The tenants roared with laughter, mocking her empire's single dying bush, and one of them even offered to water it with soda. Karen's face flushed crimson, but she tried to hold her ground, insisting that history would remember her leadership. That was when I casually mentioned, loud enough for the crowd to hear, that history might also remember who actually owned the lot. A ripple of confusion went through the group, but Karen was too caught up in her rant to catch it. She continued scribbling citations, yelling at tenants, while I leaned against my car, amused that her ignorance of my identity was turning into the greatest setup for her downfall imaginable. The next escalation came on Saturday when she attempted to hold what she called a court session in the parking lot. She set up folding chairs, brought out a gavel she had purchased online, and demanded that residents accused of violations appear before her tribunal. She wore a sash she had clearly made herself, emblazoned with the words HOA President, and banged her gavel on a plastic table as she called the first defendant. Tenants showed up out of sheer curiosity, laughing at the absurdity, filming the entire circus. One guy jokingly objected to her authority, and Karen yelled, "Overruled," while banging her gavel until the plastic cracked. She issued fines left and right, completely ignoring the fact that no one was paying her, and when people pointed that out, she claimed non-payment would result in vehicles being towed. The drama was so over the top that someone from the local news, tipped off by viral videos, actually drove by to see the madness for themselves. They caught Karen mid-rant, declaring herself the defender of order, and within days she was trending online again as Parking Lot Karen, her antics mocked by thousands of strangers. Instead of being embarrassed, she embraced the fame, strutting around the lot like a celebrity, convinced that her internet infamy was proof of legitimacy. Karen's grip on her imaginary empire was slipping, but like every self-proclaimed ruler faced with rebellion, she responded not with humility but with desperation and escalation, and Chapter 5 of this saga began with her latest stunt, which was sending out certified letters to every tenant claiming they owed her hundreds of dollars in back dues and threatening legal action if they didn't pay. The envelopes had been crudely designed with a fake HOA logo that looked like clip art of a traffic cone inside a circle, and the text inside was riddled with typos, but that didn't stop her from stomping through the building, slipping them under doors as if she were serving court summonses. Tenants were outraged, but some were also nervous, unsure if ignoring them could lead to real trouble. That nervousness was exactly what Karen thrived on, because fear gave her a sliver of control, and she strutted around the lot that day as though she had finally solidified her power. I watched quietly, knowing this was the perfect moment to let her push things too far. A neighbor stopped me in the stairwell, waving the letter, asking if they should worry. I smiled and told him not to lose a minute of sleep, and though I was tempted to reveal the truth right then, I held back, because the timing for the ultimate reveal wasn't quite ripe. Karen's next move was to organize what she called the Great Parking Census, where she marched door to door demanding everyone provide make, model, license plate, and insurance information for their cars so she could register them with the HOA. She carried a clipboard with a printed spreadsheet, acting as though she were a government official conducting a survey. Most tenants laughed in her face and slammed their doors, but a few, tired of constant harassment, reluctantly gave her the information just to make her go away. That was when I knew she was skating into dangerous territory, because collecting personal data under false pretenses could cross into actual criminal behavior. I considered stepping in, but again I chose to wait, because every outrageous step she took only made her inevitable downfall more spectacular. The true unraveling began when she tried to hold what